All right, so now it is my joy to introduce Dr. Jim Farwell, who has been my colleague these last 4 years, having joined the faculty in 2012. So most of you would not have studied with him, but now you get a chance to hear a little bit. He is our professor of theology and liturgy. His interests are liturgical and sacramental theology, theories of ritual and religion, comparative theology, and theologies of religious pluralism. Formerly, before he taught here, he taught at Bethany College, where he was professor of religious studies and philosophy and chair of the Department of Humanities. And prior to that, he taught at General Theological Seminary, Drew University, and Bexley Hall. Oh, do we have a general grad here? All right, good. And he has written 2 books. This is the Night, Suffering, Salvation, and the Liturgies of Holy Week. And I'm telling you, you are in the presence of greatness. The Liturgy Explained, more recently. And he is currently working on the Eucharist, ritual ethics, and belief in Western Christianity. He has been a Luce Fellow in a seminar on comparative theology and theologies of religious pluralism, has 20 years of parish ministry experience, has served on the board of directors for church publishing, and in addition to all of this, he is a wonderful colleague, much loved and admired at VTS. He does lots of consulting in local churches and faraway churches. And I work very closely with him because as Associate Dean of Chapel, I am constantly turning to Jim for wisdom about the liturgy, and you are about to hear some of that wisdom right now. So it's my great joy to welcome Jim Farwell to speak to us.
Thank you.
You don't need this, because you're wired.
I am wired,
okay.
And I will leave this here in case, I don't know, the spirit breaks out and we need to pass it around and talk about something. Well, good evening.
Good evening.
It's good to be with you. I was scanning over the list of names of the participants in Deep Calls to Deep just to see who I knew, and I guess you reach 4 years or something in a place, you actually start to have some people you recognize. So even if I didn't have most of you as students, I did have one of you as a student. I did have 2 of you as students, one at General and one here. And by the time the night is over, you may be glad of that. But anyway, I do know some other names and know where you are, and we've passed one another at one time or another in various venues. So it's good to be with you. My task this evening is really going to be to try to just refresh your perspective on what preaching is in the context of liturgy. So I hope that you will think about this lecture tonight as a kind of a unit together with the lectures you'll have tomorrow evening and next evening at the same time by my colleagues, Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams and Dr. Catherine Grebe, where they will be working with preaching out of particular texts. And so what I'm hoping tonight will be, since I'm not really talking about exegesis or exegesis for preaching or preaching particular texts or whatever, what I really am hoping that I will do tonight is just kind of refire your imaginations about what the sermon is in the context of the larger liturgical action. The way that I want to do that tonight is I'm going to begin with just a couple of remarks about the importance of preaching, kind of general remarks about it. Maybe remind you of something that you know. You all certainly are all experienced, so you know this by experience and intuition, but you may not stop to think about it very often. So I want to just make a couple of remarks around the importance of preaching, picking up some things that you know intuitively, bringing them to the surface. Then I'm going to give you a couple of questions that I want you to talk with each other about a little bit. Now, we're going to do that real informally, and we're not going to do kind of major breakouts and all of that because we're not really set up for that. Although when the moment comes, you can pair off or get with a couple of other people and move around the room a little bit just so you can hear each other and not the clatter of everyone around you in this extremely resonant building that we are in. We'll just take a few minutes to do that section, just to prime the pump a bit. And then I'm going to come back. I want to hear a little bit about what you shared with each other on that. And then I'm going to spend the balance of the time, the bulk of the time, actually, thinking about two things. Thinking about preaching as a microcosm of the liturgical Ordo. And if you don't remember what Ordo means in liturgical parlance, fear not, I will remind you. I want to talk about preaching as a microcosm of the liturgical Ordo, and I want to talk about preaching as a sacrament. Just playing with the boundaries a little bit that we inherit in Anglicanism around this word sacrament balance. I'm not going to leave you with the impression, I hope, that preaching and the table liturgy are doing exactly the same thing, and yet there's something sacramental about the whole liturgical action, more broadly rendered than what we mean when we apply that word to the Eucharist in particular, to the Eucharistic elements in particular. And I want to play with that a little bit tonight with you. Again, all of this simply in service to just firing or refiring your imagination about what you're doing as preachers and what that has to do with you as presiders in the liturgy and as ordained persons. So we're going to play with both of those a little bit, okay? How's that sound? Good, because that's what I planned, and if you don't like that, then you're going to have to talk Ruth Anna into something else, but that's what I'm doing. All right, just those few little kind of jump starters then, little reminder. First of all, I want you to think about your ministries, about the time that you spend week in and week out in the parish. I did this for 17 years. I don't know why the website says 2017. I guess it's close, but you know, the day in, day out, week in, week out, practices and activities that you find yourself engaged in. In that context, I want to either remind you, or maybe this is the first time you've ever heard this said, that over the arc of your ministry, I'm not talking about what happens on this day or this week or in that meeting for premarital counseling or this pastoral interaction in the hospital. Those are extremely important, intensive engagements with individuals or small groups in our ministries. But if you think about your ministry in the long arc, you will connect with more people over the course of your entire ministry, presiding and preaching in liturgy than you will do anything else you do. Over the long arc of a ministry, you have more contact with people when you are doing liturgical practice with them, in terms of the sheer number of people you're engaging with, than all of the other intensive one-on-ones and one-on-twos and one-on-threes and so forth that you do. That's really important for a lot of reasons. One is, it's really important to think about that when you think about liturgy as the moment when the church is more than any other time being what church is. If we are a people gathered up into the reign of God, whose purpose is to restore communion and shalom and connection and relationship to the God who made and redeemed us, if that is what we're about, then the liturgy, that place where the church gathers and is, if you will, face to face, not in any simple kind of presence, but face to face before God, communicating with God as a corpus, not as individuals. Remembering that for Judaism and Christianity, we are saved together or not at all. It is fundamentally about a people, the making of a people. So when you think about how much interaction you have with people over the arc of a ministry, and you realize that the place of that interaction is the most central action of the church when it's doing and being what it means to be church in communion with God, that's an enormous responsibility. But what I really want you to hear tonight is the enormous privilege that involves. So that's one thing I want to remind you of. The second thing, by the way, connected to the same point, but of a more pastoral and pragmatic nature, is that the way that you preside and preach, Elaine Ramshaw pointed this out quite a while ago in a classic little book called Ritual and Pastoral Care. The way that you preside and preach, including preaching, but all the other things that go into liturgical leadership, sets a pastoral tone. You are not being a pastor only when you leave the liturgy and go to make the hospital call on the way home. You are doing your most fundamental pastoral act when you are presiding over and connecting with the community that is together and in turn connecting with God. You are doing pastoral work. And you all know this. You're all experienced, right? You know there is a way that you can lead that communicates within liturgy the care and the concern and the oversight and the love to the congregation that you want them to sense in your own way of embodiment. Now, that's going to be different for every single one of you in here because we do this in our own bodies and we each have our own demeanor and our own presence. This is a little bit like Aristotle's golden mean. It's not an absolute, actually. It's relative, and in this case, it's relative to who you are, what you're like, how you are as a person, how you are as a public presence. And that's going to look a little differently with each and every one of us that do this, but hopefully we are all, as we do this, communicating a kind of pastoral welcome in the way that we lead the liturgy. Thirdly, and related to the second point, there's also the pragmatics of that fact, by which I mean you have all had the experience of someone approaching you for pastoral care in that narrower sense in which we typically use that term, because they connected with you first in the liturgy and you seemed approachable to them. So there's the theological truth of the importance of this liturgical action. There's the pastoral reality of the way that we communicate the gospel by our bearing and demeanor in our leadership in ways that are consistent to each one of us and our personalities and styles. And there's the pragmatic significance of this, that it does in fact also open the door sometimes to individuals approaching you for pastoral counsel, for pastoral care, for hospital visitation, to marry them, to bury someone that they love, and on and on. You know how this works. So those are just some things that I hope, with the whole line of philosophers beginning at least with Plato, if not a bit before actually, who really thought that everything that we know is a matter of remembering rather than accumulating something new. I say all of those things and make those 3 points about the theology, the pastoral, pastoralia, and the pragmatics of being a liturgical presider with the idea that I hope I'm reminding you of something you know and have experienced and can reconnect with again here while you're here. Now, so far I haven't talked very much about preaching other than to just mention it, right, as a part of the liturgical action. But in fact, in the Episcopal tradition, preaching is one element of a larger liturgical action that the Christian Assembly does together when it gathers around font and ambo and altar or table, depending on where you are on the sliding scale of Anglican Reformed Eucharistic theology. So I want to think with you about preaching now a little bit more for the remainder of our time, but I started us off the way I did because it's important to remember that the preaching is one act Something that all of you are here because you care about it, you want to get better at it, you want to refresh and strengthen excellence in the arts of preaching, but you can never do that in the Anglican tradition if you ever begin to think of the sermon as a unit in itself, because it's not. It's a part of a larger fabric of action, and it is connected with and related to, in a variety of ways, some of which I'll address tonight, the other pieces of the liturgical action. And those influence the sermon, and the sermon influences the experience of others of those as well. Now, that's all I want to say about that for the moment, because now I want you to take a moment and grab a person or a couple of persons near you. We're going to take about, 8 or 9 minutes for this. And if you need to move around the room or go sit over there or step out in the courtyard, just don't take so much time going somewhere that you have no time to talk and then come back. But you can spread out a little bit. And I want you, before I start addressing these questions, to get your own mind going on 2 questions that will relate to where I'm headed. The first one is, and they're connected, they're different modes of the same question really. What do you see preaching having to do with the larger liturgy? What do you see preaching having to do with the larger liturgy? And the second mode of the same question is, what does it have to do with the other parts or moments of the liturgy? So in one sense, I'm asking you to think a little bit about preaching in relation to the liturgy as a singular whole, but I'm also inviting you to think about what the relationship is between preaching and other particular moments or elements or steps or movements of the liturgy that we experience in the liturgical action. Just take 8 or 9 minutes, grab 2 people, probably no more than 3, have some conversation. We're going to put the video on pause for a moment so we don't just hear a clutter of a bunch of people talking. And think that through a little bit. I'll call you back by 7:30 or a minute or 2 afterwards. I want to hear some feedback from you, and then I'm going to turn to the way that I want to handle those questions. Okay? All right. Cut. I've always wanted to say that. Okay. So I would love to hear back. We don't have the time and the chance to hear from everybody, but I'd love to hear a little bit. Anybody that just feels like they'd like to share something they heard that someone else said that struck them about these questions. What do you see preaching having to do with the larger liturgy? What does that have to do with the other parts or moments of the liturgy? You can answer either or both of those together. Has anybody got anything they just really would like to share because they were struck by it? Yes, ma'am.
The sermon lets you know you need the table.
The sermon lets you know you need the table. I'm going to try to repeat or rephrase these as well as I can, just because it'll pick up on the video that way. Good. Yes. All right. So the sermon points us toward the table. Now that's actually that's one actually pretty classical way of thinking in the Reformed tradition that focuses on word and sacrament, that the word drives you to the table and the table embodies the meaning of the word. I have a good bit in the literature around this and speaking of it in that way. What else?
The sermon is the embodiment of the scripture in the same way that taking and receiving the bread and wine is the embodiment of the
Okay, we're going to come back to that one because I'll fill in the blanks on that one a little bit with the help of a particular preaching professor and liturgists who will talk about the sermon in just that way as a kind of sacramental action. With respect to a particular position he's embedded in, but I want us to sort of expand it and think about what it means for us. Very good. What else did you hear that struck you?
I heard one of my colleagues say that perhaps the sermon appeals to the more cerebral people in the pews. The table and the altar, the meal appeals to the more tactile and experiential. And that was interesting for me to hear because as the one embodying the sermon and having that experience of proclaiming,
Yes.
I think I felt a little bit disconnected from how cerebral it can be.
Very good.
Just sitting
That's
there
very
listening
good.
to it.
That's very good. There are people who relate. We know this, right? You know folks in your congregation for whom this is really a time to kind of hear pious ideas that are helpful to them in various kinds of ways they connect with it, and how strange that can be actually, because it's not just a hearing experience for you, it's a full body engagement. So figuring out how to attenuate that and how, if it's possible, to help a congregation engage it bodily. Now, Episcopalians don't do that very well, but one strand of the Black church tradition does that extremely well, right? So that the call and response and the movement and engagement and the crescendo that the preacher builds with the congregation becomes an embodied experience, and they share in it together as embodiment. We in our tradition, it's a little harder to get access to. It's a nice point. Liturgy is a complex thing, right? It's a ritual action, and like all ritual actions, it involves movement, gesture, touch, eating, smell, sight, all of the senses of the body in constellation together in an assembly. A ritual action is an embodied thing, but there are verbal elements within it. And some of what you're pushing at, I think, is what's the relationship between the words in the liturgy and the liturgy as a complex action in which we are engaging the Word with a capital W, which is incarnate, as the liturgy is, right? Yes.
I think it helps to give context because I love to celebrate, and I celebrated the Eucharist every week for a Latino congregation that had lost a priest, but I was never preaching, and they said I needed to give the hope that was within me because they said, we have no idea what you think. You're up there celebrating the Eucharist. We don't even know if you believe in Jesus.
Good.
And so it never occurred to me how important it was for me to try, no matter how inadequate I thought it might be, to articulate the hope that was within me.
Very good. So the importance for the congregation that you're leading in the full-bodied thing that is the Eucharistic liturgy also requires some kind of regulated vulnerability on your part to share who you are so that they can connect with you for the sake of the larger action. I will also return to that. This is lovely. There's all kinds of little fragments of things that I will gather back up as we go. Here? Yes.
The preaching part in relation to the liturgy seems to have an arc, because it seems the first arc, because the gospel seems to be at the top, but the preaching follows soon after, and it's part of that arc in the first part.
Okay.
And it gives a way to interpret what we have just heard. We have a meal of words in all of the readings.
A feast of words.
A feast of
yes.
words.
Good.
And
Good.
we have one way to interpret and to interact.
Good. So the sermon as a point within an arc of a larger proclamation of the Word that helps to make sense hermeneutically of that larger proclamation. That too will come back in a moment in various ways. So lots of hands here.
We also shared that there are key points in every church service that attracts people and that tends to give them something to hold on to when they leave to get through another day or another week. And the sermon and the Eucharist are those two that are like the main attraction.
Good.
And so
one of the key points in the right.
Yeah. So people will come, even if they come to church late, they'll still get there in time to hear this preaching and to receive the Eucharist because it's just that important.
Okay, good. So at least those two, and it may well be there are other points in the liturgy for different people as well that are their connection point. Never mind, I won't tell that story, it'll take too long. Let's see, here? Yeah.
I think that the preaching, proclaiming the word and preaching the word invite a response from people. And that comes in the action of affirmation of faith
Uh-huh.
I believe.
Uh-huh.
And it informs what our prayers, what we need, what we want, what we desire, what we long for. It helps us to self-reflect and go down on our knees and, you know, and reconcile and share peace with each other. I mean, all those things should be part of the invitation that grows out of the preaching.
Good. So the preaching is a kind of an invitation. So preaching is an invitation to these particular forms of response that follow it. And of course, the complexity of that for the preacher is that you are a fellow responder as well as the proclaimer. So the experience of stepping into the ambo or stepping onto the pavement before the congregation or wherever you preach from and delivering yourself of this proclamation to which the people respond, but of which you are also a member, is part of the complex spirituality of being a liturgical leader, that you are simply one of the baptized, sharing in that response to God's call, to the proclamation of the word. At the same time, you are, as an ordained person, the one who is doing that proclaiming in some real and significant way on behalf of God as a function of your orders. That's very good. Let me go back over here we'll get maybe two more.
So in some ways, is preaching a sacrifice?
How so?
And then it is a making holy. So it is sort of a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving, and it is an offering. And so it sort of foreshadows the offering. It's an offering of words, but I sort of think of it as also like this sort of transformational thing. You sort of take me, or ordinary person, and I ask God to bless and sanctify these words that I'm about to say, so that they can be a sacrificial offering, not in an atoning kind of sacrifice, but in a purely taking the ordinary and making it holy.
Good. Taking the ordinary, making it holy, a kind of sacrifice, a kind of sacramental action in that regard, which I'll come back to in my second point. That will seem familiar there, I think, too. And what there is the sacrifice? On the one hand, it is the words being broken open to communicate that which is holy, yes? In another sense, as the preacher, it is you being broken open and shared sacramentally as the one who proclaims.
Sweat and energy.
Very good.
Preparing.
Yeah, good. Okay, maybe one more. Yes, ma'am.
From the perspective of my friend, the vocational deacon, preaching prepares the congregation for the dismissal to go out and be the church in the world.
Okay, good. In some sense, the whole liturgy prepares us to go out into the world, right? This also is one of the interesting tensions in the liturgical action. It is, on the one hand, as the Roman Catholics put it in Sacrosanctum Concilium, the source and summit of everything. That's very much behind the comment I made earlier, that the liturgy is where we are doing more than anything what the church does. And the real function of the liturgy is to drive us out in the world to the liturgy that is the life of the Christian community, sharing Christ in the world, right? Robert Taft, Eastern Rite Catholic, said the point of this whole thing, now he's talking about the Eucharist, the bread and the wine, although he would agree with this with regard to the breaking open of the word as well. The point of all of that stuff is not making of special bread and wine, but the making of you and me, the body and blood of Christ, to go out and share Christ with a world that has yet to know his name. So there is that. There's a little bit of, I'm not sure if it's humor, irony, or horror, but maybe it's all three. But there's an interesting thing. If you look in the Book of Common Prayer with that order for celebrating the Holy Eucharist, around about page 400, this rite that General Convention, the last time we met, decided that can now be used on Sundays with the bishop's permission. Episcopalians love not hearing that phrase, with the bishop's permission, but anyway, with the bishop's permission, there might be particular missional contexts or context of church plants or something where there needs to be some flexibility in the way the rite is put together that's not just straight right to out of the prayer book or whatever. But we really messed up on that as well. It's really good that that's in there, because what it does, what it serves is to show us what the deep structure of the liturgy is, which is exactly what I'm going to talk about in about 10 seconds. But we also were in the process of learning or relearning on the heels of the liturgical movement what it meant to be a Eucharistic people. And now anybody who's a card-carrying member of my guild is going to tell you, without any prompting at all, that the last and important, significant moment of the Eucharist is the sending. And you notice we didn't get that in there on the list. Now, thank God you have to do it anyway, or we'd all be sitting there in the same place several years later. So you got to send people out, but it's an important thing to have listed there in that framework, because dismissal or sending is crucial to it as well. Well, good. I'm inclined to just pack up and head home, because I think those comments kind of captured most of where I was going to head anyway. But let me just focus in on these 2 points that I want to make, and you will hear how they pick up a number of the observations that you have shared with one another. So the first of the 2 things I want to talk about in the time remaining is preaching as Ordo. Right, the first thing we need to do is not embarrass anybody and make sure, in case there's anybody in the room who's forgotten how that term is used in liturgics. Ordo is a word with a very, very long history, and it has meant different things at different times. But in the hands of the leaders of the liturgical movement, and particularly under the influence of people like Alexander Shmemon, the great Russian Orthodox sacramental theologian, who was writing in the 70s, 80s, when his most prominent books are published then. In his hands, and coming out of the liturgical movement, we use the word Ordo to get at the deep underlying structure or rhythm of the liturgy. The skeletal structure of it, if you will, the bones it's built on. Pick your metaphor. The Ordo is the list of crucial things that we do together to make Eucharist. So we gather, we hear and respond to the Word of God. We offer prayer, we prepare the table, we make Eucharist, we have communion, we're sent into the world. These kind of deep elemental turning points of the liturgy, you know them and feel them every single Sunday as you lead. This is what is meant by the Ordo, and that's different than the order, right? And let me just use the example I typically use in class because it's quick and easy and hopefully will make the point. In the season of Easter, the way in which you get in to the church and settled to hear the word might involve a ceremonial procession from the back of the church with a great, lovely processional hymn, and followed by a, if you do the Collect for Purity and the Gloria or some other song of praise, and eventually everybody's seated and you hear the word. If it's Lent, maybe you don't come in from the back. Maybe the ceremonial is such that you enter in a very simple procession from the side. And maybe, obviously you're using the Kyrie or the Trisagion, not a song of praise if it's in the middle of Lent. And maybe, you suppress the Collect for Purity in Lent or something. I'd be really happy if we suppressed it right out of the prayer book, but that's a whole other deal. Topic for another day. Those are differences in order, right? The things that you do. But the piece of the Ordo that you are engaged in is exactly the same in both cases. It is the gathering of the assembly to prepare to hear the word, right? to prepare to hear the word. Okay, so that's the Ordo. Now, the really important point about the Ordo, the thing I think that sometimes people don't get, requires us to keep our eye on the ball on what ritual is. If we understand what ritualizing is in any religious context, Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, Native American, indigenous, ancient societies, whatever, given what we know about how ritual works, ritual is a dynamic sort of thing. And the way in which it signifies is not just that it does certain things. And it's not just that it does certain things in a particular sequence, but it is that it does those things in motion. The ritual is dynamic, it's moving. These points of the Ordo that lie within a liturgy and make it what it is are not frozen fixed points in the liturgy. They're pivots, they're turns. Think of it, if you like, as the liturgy taking you down a curving road, turning this way and that. And the turns are the points of the Ordo, but the point is not to be so stuck at any one of those points that the liturgy ceases to move, because if liturgy ceases to move, it ceases to signify. The meaning of ritual action is something that a group of people does together, bringing their bodies together, moving dynamically through a certain sequence of events that are interpreted and understood in certain ways outside the acting, but also understood within the acting to mean certain things, and they only mean differentially in relationship to the other points of the liturgy they're moving with. Now that's as complicated on ritual theory as I'm going to get tonight, you'll be glad to know. There's much more behind that I don't have time to say. The important thing about Ordo is it's these deep structural elements of the liturgy in a particular sequence in motion, moving dynamically. They mean, by the way, they change us, if you will, as we move from one mode to the next in this particular sequence. Now, I've already hinted at one way of thinking about what the Ordo is, that list of things I just rattled off that you can find in the prayer book under the order for celebrating the Holy Eucharist. There are actually multiple Ordos at work in the structure of the rite, and the rite itself is only one of three things that go to make up the totality of the liturgical Ordo. And again, not going to have time to linger over all of those tonight, but the other two, aside from the rite itself, are the way in which space is organized and the way in which time is organized. The calendar and sacred space, the way particular centers are set out in a particular building in relationship to one another, the way that we organize our life around certain festal occasions, ferial occasions, ordinary occasions in relationship with the festal occasions and so forth. And there's the structure of the rite itself in this dynamic motion. I'm only going to talk about the structure of the rite in my remaining remarks on this tonight, because that's enough. There are multiple ways of parsing the Ordo. I've done a little bit more with this in my little book, The Liturgy Explained. Terrible title, but I inherited the title anyway. The meaning of liturgy is in its doing, not in explaining what it does. Everything when you're explaining, including what I'm doing right now, is always secondary to the thing itself. But anyway, I inherited the title. So in that little book, I've got some more of this, but just a little bit for tonight. There's a couple of other ways you can think of this. One of these is to think of the Ordo as a deep kind of rhythmic binary. And some of you have already gotten this in some of the comments that you've made. It's a deep pattern of proclamation and response. It's a kind of rocking rhythm that patterns the liturgy. And it is, like most of these ways of thinking about the Ordo, not all, but most, something that exists macrocosmically in the whole of the rite, and also is repeated like fractals or patterns in a plant, which I guess are fractals, I don't know. in the smallest parts of the liturgy. So it's a rocking rhythm throughout. So just for a quick example, the whole of the liturgy of the Word is an act of proclamation. We gather around the center of that part of the rite, which is the proclamation of the Word of God. And we respond as a community by moving to the table. That's absolutely the broadest way in which you can render that binary. But it's also the case that within what we like to call the liturgy of the Word, there is a pattern of proclamation and response, and one of your comments got at that a moment ago. So we gather, the Word, the Scripture is read, the Scripture is preached, that's proclamation, and then what happens? We stand to our feet together and share a confession of faith, and we move then to prayer, and depending on the season, most of the time, confession of sin, and sharing the peace with one another. So just forget the liturgy of the table for a moment. The whole first part of the arc of the liturgy of the Word is proclamation, whose consummation is found in your sermon, after which the congregation turns to response. Everybody follow me? Everybody with me on this? Even more narrowly, and this is where it gets interesting around the sermon and what the sermon is. Is the sermon proclamation or is it response? The answer, of course, is yes, right? The sermon is in many ways the hinge point between that binary of proclamation and response within the liturgy of the Word. So you become, in your body and your words and your sharing of yourself and your understanding and interpretation and breaking open of the Scripture, a moment in which you are both extending the proclamation of the living Word of God, who after all is not trapped between the covers of that book. You are extending the proclamation of the living Word of God, and at the very same moment, by laying your own sort of disciplined discipleship in front of people, in your hermeneutics, in your exegesis, in your reflection, in your sharing, in your storytelling, you are setting people up to make the turn with you to respond. So that's something that's really important that's going on in the sermon with regard to the way that proclamation-response binary works its way out in the liturgy of the Word itself. By the way, just to continue and complete my example of this particular binary pattern that is the Ordo in the liturgy, you can see the same thing happen in the liturgy of the table as well. Proclamation and response. Offertory sentence, things laid out, not verbal proclamation, but embodied proclamation, spreading a table of welcome to the gathered assembly from which they will be fed, is proclamation, albeit in an embodied sense. And after prayer, preparing us to enter into that, we respond by moving to communion. Dial it down even tighter. The Eucharistic prayer itself is proclamation and response. It is a two-part prayer. It's got a complicated history. It's beyond our time and scope tonight. But it becomes, for Christians, a kind of two-part prayer, the first part of which is a long proclamation of what God has done in a kind of prayerful storytelling mode, which we inherit from our Jewish forebears. God is thanked by reciting before God gratefully what God has done. It's not that God doesn't know that. It's just a way of remembering ourselves with the God whose we are by doing that. And that's a moment of proclamation. And then there's a turn in every Eucharistic prayer. We won't worry about all the technical language tonight. You studied it all in seminary. But there's a turn in the prayer. And when we reach the point in the prayer where the Spirit is being invoked, I will use that one term, the epiclesis or epiclesis, depending, pay your money, take your choice. this invocation of the Spirit to sanctify the gifts and sanctify us, to bless the gifts, to bless us. Or in prayer D, a genuinely West Syrian prayer, the Spirit is invoked over us and then over the gifts. So that becomes the responsive moment. Having remembered who God is and what God has done, we invoke God's Spirit to do again among us what God does, taking the old and making it new, transforming bread and wine so that we are then prepared to complete the arc of our response by coming to the table and feeding from it. Okay, you get the idea, hopefully, on this binary. You can see it in the width of the liturgy, and you can see it working its way out in little turns throughout the liturgy in a variety of places. Here's another one, and this is the last one that I'll focus on tonight, and then I want to turn to our kind of second topic. The other one, you all remember this one, you all read Gregory Dix. Everybody loves Gregory Dix, The Shape of the Liturgy, right? Most of you, whatever seminary you went to, your seminary professor at some point when they were teaching about the Eucharist read the last long paragraph from Gregory Dix's Shape of the Liturgy, how he asked the question, has any sacrament, has any celebration like this been done, has any celebration been done like this in any other way? And he goes into that long recitation of on the beaches of Dunkirk and by a farmer as the field is being harvested and for my mother who is ill and on a beautiful, beautiful thing. The fortunate thing is that Gregory Dix was wrong about roughly 70% of what he said, but he did raise for us an idea, actually of a sevenfold shape, but at a more elemental level, a fourfold shape of the Eucharist, which may not actually be, as Dix thought, exactly the pattern of every ancient Eucharist that we have evidence of. We've done a lot more work since Dix, and it's clear that there's a bit more variety in early Eucharistic prayers than we were aware of yet in Dix's time. And yet, theologically, it is somehow right that the fourfold action of, come on, you can come up with it.
Take, bless, break, and give.
My heart just felt warm, and for just a moment. So, that fourfold shape of take, bless, break, give, right? And part of the reason why it's sturdy and it survives is, notwithstanding the fact that there are many early table prayers in which the words of institution were not used, the words of institution have become standard for us in the West and in the East subsequently, and that fourfold shape is clearly sort of what happens when Jesus is at table with the disciples. So it has a kind of irreducible sturdiness about it, but it comes a little bigger than just the actions of taking the bread, saying the blessing, breaking it, and giving it. It becomes a sort of pattern of the whole. So the offertory, as our colleague here, Tim Sedgwick, has put it so well, the offertory, bringing of things to the table becomes the taking. The blessing is the whole of the Eucharistic prayer. The breaking of the bread is the breaking of the bread, and the giving is the communion. There's another sort of pattern of an Ordo. Okay, why am I lingering over all of these? Well, for two reasons. First, I'm hoping to remind you that whatever else you think you're doing in the sermon, what you're doing is one moment of a dynamic, embodied corporate practice that is moving. It is moving. And the preaching that you do, if the sermon is a part of the Ordo, it's a part of the proclamation of the Word, whichever way you want to slice that, the binary or the fourfold or whatever, I'll get to that a bit more in a second. The sermon is a moment within a larger liturgical action that needs, when you're in the pulpit, to gather up what has occurred so far and to orient us toward movement toward what remains. And that broadly, figuratively means, something to the way that you imagine what you are doing when you're preaching, but very narrowly and literally, it also means that you have to bear in mind that you don't want the sermon to stall the action. Now, this does not have to do with time. I've heard 4-minute homilies that bring the Ordo to a screeching halt. And I've heard 20-minute expositional sermons, not very often, thank you, Jesus, but I have heard 20-minute expositional sermons that feel dynamic and like the movement within the liturgy has never shifted, never stopped, and I'm still in motion somehow in my pew as the preacher carries me along in what they're doing so that I can join myself to it. That seems to me something we're aiming toward if the sermon is not going to just become a stop moment. Everybody sit down, I'm going to talk some for a while, and then we'll all stand up and we'll do some more liturgy. Now, that's not it at all. Whatever you do as a preacher requires you to embody a dynamism that draws on the motion we've had going so far and drives us toward the motion that remains. That's the first thing, first implication of this business of thinking about preaching in the context of Ordo. The second, however, and this too, a couple of your comments were kind of sniffing out a little bit. The second is that the preaching is a microcosm of the Ordo. There is a way as well to think of your preaching as a moment where you proclaim and then respond, where you lay something out from the Scripture and then you lay yourself out in response to it as an invitation to draw in the response of the assembly that's listening. You can also think of it in terms, as someone did, of the fourfold shape of taking, blessing, breaking, and sharing the Word, so that Word becomes the dynamism of sacrament. The preaching actually is a microcosm of many of the ways in which Ordo can be identified in the liturgy. And by the way, the really important point there, to which I will return in a few moments, is that you can talk about that as the taking, blessing, breaking, and giving of the Word, but we're also talking there about ourselves as preachers, about offering ourselves to be blessed by God, broken open in our own discipleship, in our own regulated vulnerability, in our own self-exposure of our own discipleship. We become a kind of sacramental icon in which, if we're doing it right, the assembly should be able to see themselves, hear themselves, feel themselves as you stand before them, something in which the presence of God in you is conveyed to them. And then it really does begin to sound a lot like sacramental action, doesn't it? So let me turn to that. My second major point tonight, to talk about preaching as sacrament. The first person who inspired me to think about preaching in this way was Harold Dean Trulear. That's Trulear. Trulear was for many years the dean of New York Theological Seminary. He has also taught at Drew. He's taught at Eastern Baptist Seminary. He's taught a number of other places. Ph.D. from Drew University. Hundreds of articles. Episcopalian for couple of decades, if I remember his bio correctly, and then became Baptist. Just take a minute to let that sort itself out, because it's not usually the way it goes for what most of us experience, right? Becomes an ordained Baptist. And he's got a piece in which, more than one, but one in particular where he reflects on the black preaching experience as an experience of the preacher and the sermon being a sacrament. Now, let me footnote here, there's more than one black preaching tradition. There's more than one black ecclesial tradition, right? So this is not meant to caricature a whole sort of racial or ethnic way of doing worship, because African worship, or worship with African roots, is as diverse as the globe that it is spread across. But what Trulear is talking about is that particular tradition that most of us know of, the black preaching tradition, where the ritual is such that the climax of the liturgy is the sermon, not the table normally, And you have that phenomenon of the preacher whose art, whose style is to begin to weave something at the beginning of the sermon, that they build and pull together, and they raise with the verbal reflection they're doing the crescendo of emotional connection, and the congregation participates with them in a call and response, literally supporting the preacher as the preacher in this, we've all seen it at one time or another. It's a remarkable art. I'm jealous of it sometimes. In which the preacher is putting every bit of physical and emotional and intellectual energy they have into the building to a crescendo in which the congregation is caught up with the preacher in the experience itself. That particular kind of tradition. And he talks about the sacramental reality of that. He says, and I'm quoting here just a couple of things from this particular article, there is a sacramental reality in the preaching event as the preacher declares the gospel with an accompanying ecstasy that assures the congregation of the real presence of grace. The term we use for what goes on in the consecrated bread and wine and our connection with the real presence of Christ. Now, I don't know about you, I don't think ecstasy is a word that most people associate with my sermons, but we're talking about a particular tradition here, right? And that kind of building to an ecstatic crescendo of participation in which the preacher is laying out with some necessary elements this proclamation of the word that becomes a communication of the presence of God to the community through word, not through bread and wine. He says, by the way, that what this always has to offer is the declaration of eschatological reality, the proffer of divine perspective. He does not shrink from the fact that the preacher's role is to stand, as it were, with the eyes of God and speak to the people from the divine perspective. He does not shrink from that, and that's an important component of this notion of the sermon as a conveyor of the real presence of God. Anyway, that's the second one, the proffer of divine perspective. And the third is the invitation to take one's place in the dramatic movement of God in this life. I'll say them all again. The declaration of the let's try that again. The declaration of the eschatological reality that is our life, the proffer of divine perspective, and the invitation to take one's place in the dramatic movement of God in this life. Now, he goes on, by the way, in the whole article, to be fair to him, to talk about this as in the particulars of the anthropological, racial, ethnic, and historical context of the black church. And among other things, that means that the proclaiming of the eschatological reality is always going to have to make some contact with the God who in Jesus is crucified, who shares our suffering, and who transforms our suffering through the resurrection. That's essential to this as a part of the black experience. Now, one doesn't necessarily want to say that it's only essential there, but he does go on to say that. He goes on to say, here's one more quote by him, that in this kind of preaching experience, there is a transubstantial moment in which the word is most intensely sacramental, in which the word is consecrated in a manner not unlike the elements in the Eucharist. Now, if you ever had the experience, and I'm sure most of you had, of being in the context of that particular style of African American worship, you know what that's like. By the end of the sermon, you're in it. It's not the preacher up there at a distant ambo or pulpit doing something you're listening to. You're in it. The whole congregation is in it. And there is this way in which in the sermon you have encountered again the saving God who redeems and liberates from all of our enslavements. But I want to suggest that there is a connection point for us as well. And that connection point, and I think Trullier would take this as a friendly amendment. there is a connection point for us as well in churches that are probably, I don't know this crowd, but probably less inclined to participate in that kind of liturgical experience. There is still a connection, and the connection I suggest to you is through our ordination. Because it is important to remember our theology of orders. The basic unit of the ecclesia for us, and not only for us, is the community of the baptized. All are members of Christ through baptism. All are participants in God's mission. All are ministers in the world of the gospel. So then, what are orders again? How did we get into this peculiar thing that we all do together? Ordination is what happens when a particular person within the community, sensing a call by God but confirmed by the community, and that's why that part is so important in our process of screening and recruiting and preparation for orders, confirmed by the community, a particular person is called to stand and preside within the liturgical assembly, within the assembly of the baptized, offering themselves their own journey, their own discipleship, their own spirituality, their own encounter with God, their own deserts, all of our own of all of those things. We are called, unlike all the other members of the baptized, to stand in front of the assembly and break open for others to enter into as a goad, an invitation, a proclamation, and a word of hope that they too may enter into the same discipleship. As one of my friends put this, to be ordained is to be just like everybody else, only more so. Not everybody is called to do that, but those of you in this room are called to lay your own lives down on the altar of mission and ministry, to open those up, to offer those out to an assembly, to draw all of them into the same ministry and mission to which you are committed. It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? But that's our theology of orders, really, properly understood. We're not different somehow than the other members of the baptized. We are members of the baptized, to put the same point differently, members of the baptized who are willing to lay down our baptismal identity in front of the assembly in presiding and preaching and celebrating the sacraments and in pastoral care in a way that animates everyone we serve to commit and recommit themselves to the same deep degree of discipleship. Now, you can see where I'm going there. If that's our theology of orders, then it's worth remembering that when we step into the pulpit to preach, it is really important that we do our exegesis. Your next two night speakers would hang me up if I said otherwise. I really do believe that. It's very important to do your exegesis. It's very important to do your prayer over the text. It's very important to master all the arts that you can master and muster from all of the books and speakers and everybody else that you can get a hold of who talk about the homiletic arts. But we must never lose sight of the fact that the primary thing that's going on there is the offering of ourselves in the pulpit as sacraments, as walking, living, breathing sacraments. One of the things that drives me absolutely nuts, and there are a few of them, those of you who've studied with me will know, but one of the things that drives me absolutely nuts is this resurgence that we're seeing in the Episcopal Church, and we are, in ordinations of candidates having their hands anointed at the ordination. There's a resurgence of this. If you haven't seen it, I guarantee you will, sooner or later, visiting somebody's ordination. What's so wrong-headed about that is that it is implying that what is sacramental about the priest is that their hands are the hands that are doing its stuff with God's holy things. When what's sacramental in ordination is you and me, from head to toe. It's not the laying on of hands. It's not the oiling of anything. It's not the vestments around your neck. It's not your connection to the bishop. It's none of that. It's you. The matter of the sacrament in ordination is you. And so, when you stand in the pulpit and preach, your sermon, hopefully, is something that never fails, and we all do fail at this, right? But hopefully never fails to be more than the exegesis of the word, more than the mechanical arts that go with doing it well, more than the rhetorical skills that come with practice, but that it's got 110% of you in it. That sermon is who you are. It's not what the commentaries finally say, but it's taking all of those things into the crucible that is you, your own life, your own discipleship, your own glorious connections with God, and your own deep deserts where God seems unavailable. All of that, all of you, is what we asked you at ordination to bring to the preaching moment and to the moment of presiding at the table. That is the way in which we are sacraments, and that is the way in which, even though we're in a liturgical tradition with a different kind of emphasis than the one that Trullier is describing, that I would also want to say that preaching is itself a sacrament. The breaking open of the Word, but our ongoing willingness to break open ourselves before the community. Now, one final little footnote about that. You'll notice I've used the phrase twice. I've said something like regulated vulnerability. Okay, y'all been in ministry for a while, you know what I'm talking about here. I'm not particularly looking forward to hearing a psychological striptease from any of you in your preaching, right? And I know you don't want to hear mine. We're talking about appropriate levels of sharing, but appropriate levels of sharing is what you're doing all the time as a priest, and you're doing it in the pulpit as well. Offering your own life, the stuff of your own life, to be taken, blessed, broken, and given by none other than God as a sacrament to the assembly, inviting them into the very same discipleship that you share with them. It's never about you. It's in the end about the assembly. You are a sacrament of the assembly, a sacrament of God. That's what all that in persona Christi, in persona ecclesia stuff means in theologies of orders. You're the focal point of both of those things, and in the end, it's not about you. It is about, as the words have it over the gates at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky, God alone. So that God is all in all, and that our ministries might in some way contribute to that work that God is doing, and seems that God will do that. Many days it doesn't seem like a good idea, but it seems that God will do that only through us and with us and in us, and that's what the sermon does as well. Okay, I hope this has been helpful in some way. The whole thing, part of it, some idea in it, might not even be something I said, might be something you heard in one of the exchanges you had. But just as a way of remembering again, what have we done, what was the purpose here? Just to remember again what it is we're doing when we preach in relationship to the larger liturgy. Just to refresh our sense of that. You know, at some level, everything I've said ought to scare the crap out of you. It scares the crap out of me too. But God is sufficient, and God has called, and God will deliver, and we can trust that. And all of those are the things that go into what it means to be responsive for us as priests to that call that God gives. Okay? Thank you for your attention. Sure, yeah.
Speaking of Gethsemane, which is on its way there right now, so
That's all right.
Keep them too late, but we have maybe 3 minutes.
Yeah, so anything, comments, observations, thoughts, questions?
The next 8.5 years, we're going to probably get to hear Bishop Michael Curry preach a lot.
Yes.
So he represents a particular black tradition.
Yes.
Is there anything that you've noticed that we might learn from him? Not that we're going to learn to be preachers the way that he preaches, but what might we pay attention to from him that relates to our topic?
Yeah, a couple things, I think. I mean, I watch him and listen to him with great interest. One thing is the way in which he does channel elements of that African-American tradition of preaching into his presence and the way that he delivers the word even when he preaches. There is a lot to be learned from that lay a brick, lay another brick, go back and lay some other bricks in, start putting some bricks on top, build an emotion, draw it in, build an arc. I mean, you can see him do that when he preaches, and I think there is something that we have to learn from that particular black preaching tradition that he does. That's one thing. The second thing I love that he does is he does something that strikes fear in the heart of every Episcopal priest, at least the first 6 months they're out, is he is not enslaved to a text. He knows where he wants to go, you can tell, but he is not enslaved to a text. And we would all do well to learn increasingly, maybe over the course of a career, your whole ministry, not to be enslaved to the text. I mean, you can tell when he preaches, he's done some homework and he's probably written some things down, but it's also evident that he's spent an awful lot of time digesting that and owning it and getting it inside. So he will glance at a card or you'll see him follow the points on a text, but you can tell that he is not afraid as he gets a hold of something or something gets a hold of him to let it loose and go with it a little bit and not fear that all will be lost and he'll never find his way back again. It'd be nice if we could all learn how to do that a little better. And he does keep it moving. I mean, that is the business about the Ordo being dynamic, meaning the sermon has to be dynamic and move as well. It does move, and that, again, is something to be learned from that African-American preaching tradition. There's a clear arc. You know you're going somewhere, and you know at the beginning you're laying some foundation. As you build the foundation and start moving, it picks up speed, it picks up energy, and there is a sense that it's going somewhere. By the time you get to the end of it, you're ready to stand up and say that creed, even if you don't like the creed. You're just ready to get up, and do something, ready to stand as a body and say something. So I think we have a lot to learn from him and should watch him for a while. Yes, sir?
This isn't entirely about sermon, but it's another moment where we often get up and put ourselves out there, and it's the announcements, which because I didn't have you in seminary, I'm really curious to what you would say about talk about stopping the Ordo.
Liz, Nick, would you just like to do this for me?
Stopping the Ordo, sometimes it takes longer than the sermon did.
Yes.
But, I mean, it's a related thing.
You're doing fine. Keep going. Yeah. Keep going.
Every time when we get up there and we lay some things out.
There is, I'll restrain the rant due to time and just say there's no good place for announcements. Now, when you do them, because you're going to do them, because there's some practicalities to, would that everybody could just do the liturgy and then read the dang bulletin board about everything else they need to know. But we know they're not always going to do that. And we also know there are things that we want to accent as a part of the liturgical assembly. My preference would be that you've put your finger on it mostly. A, you keep them short. And B, you remember this is a liturgy. So think about what the meaning of the liturgy is. The liturgy is an action in which the assembly of God's people is coming together in worship, being animated and formed and reformed again into the mission of God, and then run that filter over all the possible things that you could include in the announcements. And while I would love to imagine that everything that every one of us announces in the announcements in the liturgy on Sunday we all know that there's stuff up there that could just as easily be said elsewhere. So stick to what's central, stick to what's core. What announcements need to be made about things the assembly is doing that look like the mission of God in the world? And if you need to remind people what time the tea party convenes or something, surely that can be done through an email or some other time, right? So you take a razor to it and you keep it as limited as possible, and you pray to God the day will come when you will never have to do the announcements at all. There you go. Yes, ma'am.
You just said many things that are just sticking in my head. So,
that may be good or that may be bad.
No, I think it's good. One thing is that you said at the very beginning that I'm still chewing on, that idea that Judaism and Christianity is the salvation of all, but not at all. And it makes me think, it's provoking me to think about the question of open communion. So if the assembly is present, and it's the salvation of the assembly, regardless of who walked in, how that, I guess I want to know your take on it. Does that affect?
How long do we have tonight? Yeah, I was trying to get to Kentucky tonight, but I don't think I'm going to get there until Thursday when I'm done answering this. Now, I don't want to be flip, but I will say, precisely because I don't have enough time to sort of do that question justice, I will say, I'll say a word or two, but then I have written on this. It's been quite a while, but in truth, I wouldn't change a lot of what I said about it. So if you want to go dig up the Anglican Theological Review, it was either 2004 or 2005. I have an article called Baptism, Eucharist, and the Hospitality of Jesus. And that'll give you the fuller sort of rationale for what I'm about to say. But in short, there's a paradox to the liturgical assembly, right? There's an integrity to it. So when the baptized people come around and gather around the table, they are gathering with some degree of a conscious, explicit commitment to enter into a particular way of life. It looks like hospitality on the surface. It ends up being disingenuousness to open up a sacrament that has all of the injunctions and significance and call and demand. As Gordon Lathrop puts it, there is welcome at the table, but there is also warning. It's disingenuous to just sort of say, oh, it's just a table, it's just a meal, right? It is just a meal like any other meal, but it is also at the same time, it's not an either or, a meal like no other meal. And in the dynamic tension of what makes the Eucharist a sacramental meal, as opposed to other kind of meals that we do with people who are part of the assembly and people who aren't, the tension there gets at how disingenuous it is to treat that table as if it's just for anybody that wanders in. Now, the hope, right, this is where the paradox comes in, is that the assembly in its purpose is there to be formed and shaped to be part of the mission of God that's out in the world drawing everybody in. But people's freedom matters and the integrity of the tradition matters. And so in honor of both of those, and given that we have lots of ways to be welcoming to people in the assembly other than that moment of the Eucharistic, the communion, the bread and wine, I can't get on that train. It's a compelling argument. It's an important thing for us to think about. Ultimately, I can't get on it. And I'll tell you, I'll even the monks will wait on me for 2 more minutes. Give me 2 minutes and you say just one word about this that isn't in the essay that I wrote some years ago. Is over the course of time, it's become clearer to me. And I'm actually writing about this in the book that I'm trying to get finished this August for NYU Press on the Eucharist. It's become clear to me that the issue around free communion, technically, or open table, or whatever you want to call it, is a kind of bellwether of the moment that we're in as a church, where we are trying to figure out the decision we need to make between two alternative ecclesiologies, two alternative understandings of the church. The one is one in which we imagine the Christian life to be a matter of deep formation, the baptism of our desire and our action into an assembly that allows its life to be transformed in a particular way, that people are coaxed and catechized and taught and brought into that through prayer and reflection and teaching and modeling of mission behavior and all that sort of thing. That's the sort of ecclesial model that was underlying the birth of the 1979 prayer book, and indeed the whole liturgical movement. 40 years out now, if you count it back from when we started having whatever, the Green Book, the Zebra Book, all of that. 4 decades out now in this moment of significant transition culturally, where we're all wringing our hands entirely too much, by the way, about how we need to change everything yesterday or we're not going to be here tomorrow. Last time I checked, this is God's business, not ours, and I think it's going to survive. We don't need to worry about that. It may take different forms, however, and in the context of the whole debate about that, there's another kind of ecclesial model that's coming to the surface that you see in things like the open communion business or the Mass on the grass out with the wider public, or even open baptism, right? Anybody want, come on, well, let's just come on in, open baptism. I know congregations that do that. That ecclesial model is a different kind of model than the deep catechetical model that came in with the 79 prayer book. It's more of a kind of public church model. If you were going to develop that ecclesiology, it would involve thinking about the church, thinking about the whole world as sacrament in some way, and the church as a tip of an iceberg that's actually going on everywhere all the time, and it's just being manifested here in a particular way when a certain assembly comes together as a kind of event, and then it disperses again. That's the kind of groundwork you would build on for an ecclesiology of that type. And as we're struggling with what our connection with God's mission in the world looks like in this next generation, what's at test here is the catechetical, formational, ecclesial model that is deep in the 79 prayer book. And we're thinking about another model, and some people think that's the way we've got to go, and other people think that's missing the point entirely. And some way or another, these two things will talk to one another and learn from each other, and we'll get to some better third place by the grace of God. But, see, I could go on, but I'll stop with that. Read the essay in ATR, and you'll hear what I want to say.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Thanks.